Okay, thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and to talk about this wonderful, fascinating book. Yeah, I mean, as Ricardo mentioned, we go back a number of years, and the first time we ever actually met was in a coffee shop called Café de Paris in what was then the crumbling old colonial downtown of Luanda. At that point, 2002, I think it was exactly a week after Jonas Savimbi was killed. This cafe was still very much a relic of, I guess, that bit of colonial Angola which had carried over, become run down during the years of war, still with waiters wearing very threadbare white shirts and bow ties. That's where Ricardo and I had our first conversation about Angola. There have been many more over the years, particularly since he supervised my doctorate. Recently, or a few years ago, when I was back in Luanda, I went to see what was where Café de Paris now was. Like every second building in downtown Luanda, it's a bank. With shiny glass, chrome, plastic, illuminated and everything. There's an extraordinary number of banks in Angola. And I just think that transformation of that little bit of real estate from a crumbling cafe into a shiny bank is kind of a little vignette in what's happened to Luanda over those years, and it's what Ricardo captures, among other things, in the book. As I said, we've spoken a lot about Angola over the years. Nevertheless, reading Ricardo's book, there was such a lot I hadn't realized before. New insights, stuff that I was really interested to read. I think, I've been asked about Angola a lot. Often when I talk about it, people don't quite grasp what it's actually like. They think I'm a pessimist. They don't believe it's as extreme as I describe it as being. I remember once, around about the same time, 2001, 2002, in Luanda, two Swedish journalists who'd arrived in the country recently asked me what I thought of the situation then. I gave a frank opinion. They said, "Oh, you're a pessimist." I said, "No, I'm an optimist." But there is something about that country which is excessive in so many ways, and I think it's post-war trajectory. People will sometimes still buy this illusion that because investment comes into a country, because there's peace, investment plus peace equal democratization and prosperity. I think that's always been nonsense, and Ricardo's book, more eloquently than anyone else, blows that myth out of the water for good and all. And congratulations on doing that, because it's complete nonsense, and it needed to be debunked. What the book is, it's a narrative about a powerful elite using a post-war moment to consolidate its control, to intensify its control over a society in a most illiberal way, to use a term that Ricardo's used in his own work. I think one of the things that makes it such a compelling and readable book, in spite of the depth of its analysis, it's the way it mixes the anecdotal with the analytical. It's constantly drawing links between its analysis on the one hand of culture and of society, and on the other hand its analysis of political economy, without ever falling into a unidirectional deterministic relationship between one or the other. There's just this constant dialogue between the social, the cultural, and the political and the economic. This also gives rise to an interesting tension, which I think is there in the very first paragraph of the introduction, where you start with that vignette of standing on the Ilha de Luanda Island, looking across the bay to this new skyline of Luanda at night. And the kind of dazzling impact that this has, from this angle, you could forget about the slums, you could forget about the vastly high infant mortality rates and the other manifestations of poverty and misery that exist in Angola. And I think it's a tension that runs through the book. I mean, to what extent is this a real project of development, and to what extent is it a chimera? of development. And you know, I'm reminded of work I did about UNITA, and UNITA, the former Angolan rebel movement. They had an illusion of their own state-like status, which was manifested in this vast Potemkin village, or Potemkin city really, built with South African assistance at Jamba in southeastern Angola near the Namibian border. And I think as for UNITA in the bush, so for the MPLA in Luanda, you create this illusion of a state in order to convince yourself that to convince yourself of your own legitimacy, and in the hope of somehow assuming that other people will believe the smoke and mirrors as well. As I say, I think it's a tension in the book about how real is it, or what actually makes this work. And I mean, if you could say a word or two about this in your comments, I mean, I'd really appreciate it. Does it work because people believe that there is a real project going on that will eventually lead to an increased prosperity for the whole country, which will have benefits for everybody? Or is it just the illusion itself is compelling? The other fascinating thing about the book is José Eduardo dos Santos, whose name occurs so often it gets abbreviated to JES to save on ink. How much depends on him? You know, I think as social scientists and historians, we're all slightly uncomfortable about lumping too much, putting too much analytical weight on a single individual. And again, I'm reminded of the Angolan Civil War, that people say, oh, it was all about Savimbi, wasn't it? I'm very, very uncomfortable about this. You know, I like to look at structure, and I like to look at belief and identity, and you know, a more genuine hegemony than the towering weight of one person. But, you know, it's difficult to write these big figures out of the narrative. And, you know, how do we square the role of individuals with the desire for both for desire to see agency and agency on the part of a wider range of people, and also the desire to acknowledge structure. So I think a message of this book is that there's an assumption that a process of development is a process of nation building, and that certainly there's an underlying assumption, an underlying wish in this process of reconstruction, that a process of nation building will come out of it. And you know, as you note, there are criteria of exclusion and inclusion here. This is certainly not ever going to be an inclusive project of nation building. Nevertheless, you do talk about the middle class, although you acknowledge how tiny and relatively insignificant that middle class is. I'm interested to know, to what extent do you think the narrative is aimed at them, and to what extent they will buy into it? Because yeah, I think certainly, as you say, in the last couple of months, as the illusion has really been laid bare by the greater repression that's happened, with the massacre in Wambo province, with Rafael being sentenced again and receiving a jail term, and more recently with the 15 activists who've now been in prison for 7 weeks without legal process. With this increasing repression, we've actually seen an increasingly vocal reactions coming exactly from that middle class, from the intellectual stratum of society. It's interesting to know whether the small stake, the small economic and material stake, which the middle class has in the system which has been constructed since 2002, does that in any way keep them silent? That's before we even talk about the huge number of excluded Angolans, of course, who have seen absolutely nothing from this, as you say, and you know, who I think ultimately are going to be the drivers of, or the driving force behind any eventual change. However, at the moment, it's very difficult to see through what channels that change is going to come. Can we talk about any success in this this aspiring hegemonic project of the MPLA through its control of the state and through its control of this process of reconstruction. Or simply, is the state simply going to continue falling back on force, which I'm afraid the experience of the last 6 months makes me think will be the case. How much time have I got, Chris?
I'm afraid 5 seconds.
5 seconds. Okay, I'll leave out what I was going to say about Angola, about our identity politics and the Creole identity, which is kind of reinforced by this new project. But you do mention it, and it's a very interesting point. So, I mean, I'll just leave you with the last question, which is something I've discussed with every other journalist and academic who's worked in Angola and has read your book. Where did you get that information from? I mean, I don't use the word awesome lightly, and I use it in the sense of the word awe-inspiring, but the access you've had, the sources you quote, albeit anonymously for obvious reasons a lot of the time, how did you get there? Because, I mean, you get closer to power than any other researcher ever has, and, I mean, that's the most extraordinary achievement of this book. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin, and thank you, Justin, and thanks for some riveting insights yourself. You already have a lot to chew on there, Ricardo. But I mean, there are several narratives developing here, not in the least that of a closed society, a place that we know very little about, a place in which opulence is being amassed under the banner of development. Fascinating and riveting indeed. It's talking about closed societies. I'm now going to hand over to Elias from the Open Society Foundation. Welcome to you as well. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, muito obrigado por esta oportunidade. Eu gostaria de dizer que it's a great privilege and honor to be here because it's not so easy and it's not so possible in Angola, for us to gather as academics, as people with interest in this issue, to gather like this in one of the universities in Angola. Rafael is here. Probably you don't need to be ANC member to be here. You just need to be a citizen of the world to be here. And unfortunately in Angola, for you to participate, to be a citizen of the country is not sufficient enough. And that, brings me to a question. I'm not going to respond directly, to the book, but I'm just going to lay down some elements that come out of the book but relates to Angola. One of the biggest questions that many people ask today in Angola, what was the main reason of the civil war? Probably some of us did understand why the liberation struggle against the Portuguese had to be done. But what we see now is that after 2002, the country has gone into much deeper levels of exclusion, political intolerance, repression. So we see that all the elements that the ruling party, because it's the one in power, all the ideological elements, aspirations to free the people, not just politically, but also economically and socially, is not a reality. Because there is a big gap between the ruling elite and the people themselves. Pierce has been talking about middle class. I don't know if in Angola there is a middle class. Because the issue of exclusion is so big in Angola that it's so difficult for you to define a line between those in power, those who have political power, also have access to economics, and those who don't have anything. What has happened is that those who won the war in 2002 really got access to political power and to economic privileges and excluded everybody who is different, was not part of the process. Because if you go to Angola today, the wealthy people in Angola are only members of the ruling party. I don't know any other Angolan who is not a member of the ruling party, who is a millionaire, who has access to the wealth, who has access to the oil business, who has access to diamonds. Probably those generals from UNITA who defected in 1992, probably those. So the gap is there. As the book has been able to explain, the growth and development that Angola has been experiencing in the last 10 years has really changed the image of Angola. For those who knew Angola before 2002, Angola has changed completely. There's no doubt about that. But the real question is that as Angola transformed itself, because change is not all the time transformation. And what we see in Angola is that the growth, the economic growth and development has not brought significant social transformation. The people who have political power are the ones who have economic power. And they don't allow anybody else to access. The privatization of the state is true. Angola seems to be a multi-party democracy since 1992, but in fact what reigns in Angola is still a one-party state which accommodates the opposition, does not accept the opposition, accommodates the opposition. Because the issue of reconciliation has just stopped at a political level. It has not gone into the economic reconciliation, the social reconciliation. And that's why many times in Angola we have a situation that the levels of political intolerance is so high. Even after so many peace agreements have been signed, as Pierce has said, in the last 1 year we have really gone back in the rhetorics of the war, whereby if you have a different opinion, then you are a threat to development and peace. And that's the rhetoric that the government is using. And we see more and more the levels of political intolerance increasing, whereby the public media quite often comes out, bring up the memories of the war, reminding that these are the people who fought, these are the people who fought. The process of reconciliation has not integrated a healing process in the country. It was a political agreement. Someone has won the war, accommodated those who have lost, but the healing process, the reconciliation process in Angola has not taken place. And that's one of the things that the politicians, those who are in the ruling party, and some of you who are in the opposition, they don't want to dig deep in the wounds of the war and so that we can heal the wounds and we can define what type of a country we want to build. And that's why many people in Angola today ask, what kind of a country do we really want to build? One of the aspects that needs to be pointed out is that the checks and balances in Angolan democracy, which as an Angolan, as a taxpayer in Angola, I define it as a totalitarian democracy. It accommodates other political parties but does not accept them to be. It allows them to exist but does not allow them to be. So what we have in Angola is that the identification of the enemy rests on your thinking differently, on your speaking differently. If you look at the parastatus companies in Angola today, like Sonangol, Indiana, and many others, you will not find a single staff, especially in the management level, who belongs to the opposition. So the whole country functions, okay, we have other political parties in the National Assembly, but in the terms of economics and social space, they are not allowed to do. So one of the things that we try to do as open society, which is very, very difficult in the context that we live, is really the promotion of human rights. As I said, many people have mentioned the issue of political intolerance has increased. Extrajudicial killings are happening in Angola. People are being killed. We have the situation 3 or 4 months ago of a religious group that unofficial sources state that over 400 people have been slaughtered or more. We have the situation of people being thrown into crocodile-infested rivers for their bodies to disappear. We have a situation whereby 15 young people just to read a book and to discuss a book is a treason to be arrested. And what we try to do is to promote human rights, and it's not really easy. And the issue of corruption, the issue of impunity, the checks and balances in Angola do not function because Parliament does not really fulfill its role. It has become simply a rubber stamp of the executive. Parliamentarians are not accountable to citizens, they are accountable to their ruling party, to their parties, whether the opposition or the ruling party. So it's a very tricky situation because as we move towards 2017 elections, we see more and more the government, the ruling party and its government, really to find ways of maintaining its power, its grip on the government controlling the country. So the issue of Angola, of being a democracy, which many people say is not just by having a constitution itself, it's by practice, implementation of policies, inclusive policies and so on, which is really a big challenge up to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elias, and sorry for rushing you there. I just want us to start to bring in our participants from the floor. Last but not least, our panelist is Rafael. Rafael, welcome. Take 10 minutes, please, at the most.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I would like also to thank Ricardo for the invitation and Good Governance Africa, and to apologize to the University of Joburg because early in the day I spoke on a program on television that the meeting would be at the University of Leeds. It's just because I go to Leeds all the time, so my apologies. And I would like just to add to the conversation rather than making different points. And I must say that Ricardo's book provides an overall strong understanding of Angola's current political economy that no other author has been able to do so far in terms of an update of the whole spectrum of Angolan politics and how oil essentially plays a major role in it. And from the numbers given by Ricardo, I would like just to talk about the hegemonic nature of the ruling party and how also it has a lot to do with what Ricardo described as a system of some sort of illusion, this idea of modernity. Just last Saturday, I covered a march and was briefly held for that, in which the police was unable to contain over 50 protesters, most of them mothers and relatives of these political prisoners who have been arrested for reading books on nonviolence. And my question there, as I saw these women marching and chanting, freedom now, and the police scrambling to follow them and to stop them, I thought, how do these guys have the biggest army in Southern Africa and all the state security apparatus? Simply because the mothers, advised by someone, said, take the pavement this way, and there was no security that way. So it took a kilometer for the police to reassemble and to be able to stop them with dogs and serious beatings. What also is quite important in terms of this hegemonic understanding of power in Angola, and Ricardo also talks very fluently about it in his book, is the contract, the hiring of Brazilian marketeers to promote the image of the government. And Brazilians have been in Angola basically running the media and the image of the government since '92, and the government has been spending around over $20 million a year just to clean up its image. And what failed in this event is that after news came out that the police beat up the mothers, the reaction from the public was very strong. The statement that police put out and the propaganda that followed suit was remarkably infantile, because the police denied it had happened. No one had been beaten up, and was able to corrupt a mother to come on television to say, look, the mothers were with me and we marched peacefully with the police protection. And of course no one believed it. But what I'm giving this anecdote is because the current economic crisis, as the oil prices fell, the government is not able to pay the Brazilians for that propaganda. And so many of these numbers Ricardo gave of Brazilians, Portuguese, they're leaving the country in droves, you know. Thousands of people leaving weekly, because just last week the Cubans completed the withdrawal of over 300 medical doctors and personnel working in the health sector and education sector because of lack of payments for the past 3 years. So we had this economy that boomed, and now we're facing the bust period. And as, again, Liz pointed out in the book, there is no real diversification of the economy. Everything remains centered around oil. And once the prices go down, and also because of the spending habits of the elite, this idea of modeling the country, or Luanda at least, as a new Dubai, with skyscrapers that essentially cater for foreign investors and what in Angola we call the expatriate community, those who come to provide services because the prices are unaffordable to Angolans. Many of these skyscrapers are now empty in the city, and with extremely high levels of maintenance. Just to give you an idea, in one building where 4 major oil companies are housed, the expenses on fuel because of what here you call the load shedding, they spend around $50,000 a month just on fuel to keep the elevators running and the building lit for a month. So that's the kind of twisted development we have faced. And another important factor as well is how can we improve our numbers to look great in terms of statistics. In the past 10 years, and I always point this because no country can develop without education of its own people. In the past 10 years, the government allowed for the setting up of more than 40 higher education institutions, universities. And so within years, we had a whole population going to university without actually going through high schools because of the number of universities were higher than the number of high schools created in the same period. Yes, and bad universities. So just days ago, the Ministry of Higher Education came out publicly saying that most of the courses in these universities are illegal. Therefore, the diplomas of all these people that in the past 10 years have been trained are not really valid. You know. And we had a similar experience, which I think in the next book Ricardo should touch. And there is a lot of conversation on how this time the government circumvented the United Nations, the Western pressure, and remodeled or refashioned its own vision of the country by doing it itself. But also there is a great mention, and that's why the book is comprehensive, of some individuals who became sort of freelance providers for the government. Arms trade dealers like Pierre Falcon, who was in jail in France for all sorts of wrongdoings. Arkady Gaidamak, who essentially went to the government in the early 90s and made a proposal, late 90s, that he would take control of the diamond sector in Angola in exchange for intelligence and the killing of Jonas Savimbi, essentially, the destruction of UNITA. And that's how a company, Ascorp, was set up as part of that deal, and then the Israeli support was provided for the government to end the war. So what it created was a situation in which the government won the war, but also it had extremely highly demanding individuals who needed to get all those billions from oil and other resources. And the deals with China also went through this sort of private operators. And one question remains essential in Angola as well, and Ricardo touches and has done a great study about Sonangol, the national oil company, as a parallel state in Angola, as a parallel system of power for the president. And one important, and also as a sort of haven for competence in the country. But one aspect that explains how this government has been able to hold power for so long has to do not just with corruption, but with the undermining of the function of the rest of society and the rest of the companies. So if you have a country that has grown its economy tenfold in the past 10 years, then you ask yourself, how can it be reliant on one competent company? We have a national airliner, we have other companies, and in '96, just to give you an example, I was an interpreter for a group of foreign experts who did an assessment of the 10 most strategic state companies. And to my amazement and amusement, I would put that way, the National Diamond Company, which has the exclusive concession rights to the diamond mines in the country, was profiting from a clinic it had, not from the core business of extracting and selling diamonds. So in its financial records, its profits were only coming from this clinic. not from selling diamonds. And basically it was an easy business. The company, all it had to do was to rent the concessions and collect the royalties and the money from the partnership, the profits from the partnership. So these are just some of the examples to explain the distorted view of development we have promoted over the years in Angola. And also how, for instance, Sonangol has been used for a number of investments in Portugal. There was this notion that for the first time ever in Africa, a former colonized country was buying up the former colonial master. In fact, all these investments were to ensure that the Portuguese would continue to provide support for the regime. And again, as an idea that just up to 2 years ago, Portuguese workers in Angola were sending remittances of over 200 million euros in salaries and fees back to Portugal. And remittances from Angola to Portugal, I don't think amounted to 18 million euros, if so.
Rafa, just 1 more minute at the most, please, man.
Yes.
If you don't mind, sorry about that.
Anyway, I will leave that minute for the debate. Thank you.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.